Andrea, tell me where you think this quote comes from.
All right.
Okay, I love this quote. Of all the things at risk, the loss of an objective reality is perhaps the most dangerous. The death of truth is the ultimate victory of evil. When truth leaves us, when we let it slip away, when it is ripped from our hands, we become vulnerable to the appetite of whatever monster screams the loudest.
I mean, it's a good quote.
It's powerful, right?
I'll give you that. My mind goes to George Orwell, 1984. There's been a lot of posts about that, believing our eyes and ears. But I'm gonna say, I feel like he wasn't that on the nose. I'm gonna say Brave New World, Aldous Huxley.
I think you're in the right direction.
Okay.
So that is from a Senate speech, if that
Okay.
helps you. That
Okay.
is Mon Mothma from Andor.
There we go.
Yeah,
There we go.
On the eve of the rebellion against the Empire.
So I've seen this show, so I should have known. And if you haven't watched it, I don't even watch the other Star Wars. It's an outstanding show.
Yeah.
And wow, let's paint that on some billboards.
Right. Yeah, it certainly feels like it meets the moment.
I think
right?
so.
Welcome to Political Reality.
We are Steve and Andrea, and today we are here to talk about immigration.
Immigration.
We're recording on Tuesday, January 27th, and we're saying that because the news is changing quickly, and things that are happening in this country have been we don't know what will have happened by the time this is released, but we wanted to talk about immigration today as it's something that is really the main backdrop of a lot of the more recent headlines around ICE and everything going on in Minnesota.
Yeah, and as always, we're going to focus on giving the facts to inform whatever your thinking is about immigration. At least it'll be an informed decision.
That's right.
Right, informed opinion. But before we get into immigration, we're going to do a They Said What segment and it's kind of related, on purpose. So a lot of representatives from the Trump administration, including the Secretary of Homeland Security and others, have portrayed the two people who were shot in Minnesota, Renee Good and Preddy, is that the guy?
Alex
Preddy, as terrorists. They were there to create mayhem. They were essentially domestic terrorists. They were there to kill people, basically.
Right.
So that, I think, relates to the quote we said at the beginning of the show. It's like, don't believe what you're seeing on these videos. This is the reality we want you to believe.
Right.
And it's just, I think, more than anything else in recent memory, the disconnect between what
we're seeing.
Yeah, but what we are seeing and what the people in power are saying is huge.
Yeah.
It's just too big for many people. Because it is just outrageous. The objective evidence in no way supports that conclusion.
That's right. I will also say that the word terrorism means something very specific and is ideally, much like many other terms that we use, like fascism and dictatorship and genocide, are terms that really mean something. And using it to mean someone you don't care for or someone you disagree with is dangerous broadly. And I'm personally quite affected by these murders, and my heart breaks for their families. And then to, on top of it, have to deal with being accused of being a terrorist is quite hard to imagine going through. And I will also say that, to your point about the opening quote and believing our eyes and ears, I watched the Renee Good footage. I didn't want to watch it, and then I thought I'd better watch it. And there's sort of some decision making around how much we expose ourselves to these things, but it felt responsible to watch it, so I watched it. Horrible. And then I saw a quote from Kristi Noem saying, wow, she was obviously a domestic terrorist. And I physically gasped out loud because I do think, and this show is about, it's not about partisan sides, it's about the reality.
It's about objective reality,
and
as much as we can get there.
It was so removed from what I had just observed. I'm not an expert on law enforcement. I'm not an expert on how you're supposed to de-escalate or anything. And just watching this video, that was not the behavior of someone who I would consider a terrorist.
Yeah, and to your point about terms mean something,
yes.
words mean something.
Yes.
But some words they don't necessarily have a very specific operational definition. They are more of a gestalt,
sure.
right? So what does terrorism mean? There's what we call the demarcation problem.
Yes.
And we're going to be getting into this a lot with topics that we're covering, where it's a continuum, and you kind of know it when you see it, and you're over some fuzzy threshold saying, yeah, that's terrorism. Like, not all acts of violence are terrorism.
Correct.
Right?
Correct.
So this was nowhere near that fuzzy line, in my opinion, what either of those people did. So that contributes to that statement being outrageous. But they're exploiting that fact
yes.
that you could throw out words like, well, how many people have to die for it to be a genocide? Like, there's
right.
no number, it's no
right.
percentage. It's just, it's kind of a vibe. Like, you kind of know it when you get there. So they're exploiting, I think, that
right.
fuzziness.
Right. And I think it is a false. It's a human desire for clarity to say that, and we talked about this in the democracy episode, to say that there's some magic number after which a country goes from not a democracy to a democracy. And we talked about this with medicine, where there's some magic number where I go from unhealthy to healthy.
Yeah.
And there's obviously thousands of inputs. It's not just my temperature. It's not just my, whether I'm coughing or what have you. But I do think that we both want to put things in a category because it feels tidy and clean. And if it suits your political agenda to say this is terrorism, and then everyone who believes you will rally around and say, oh, it's obviously terrorism, we're fighting an even bigger threat than we thought, it appeals to that. But it also obscures the fact that, indeed, as you said, it is a spectrum. Though, and I may be working from terrorism definitions, I started studying this stuff after 9/11, and there was a lot of talk in political science about, well, what is terrorism?
Yes.
And there, it was much more about how do we draw a distinction between something that we would call more like a militarized international dispute or an international conflict versus terrorism. And the key distinction, as I recall, and this is not my area of expertise, the key distinction is that it's conflict and it's militarized and it's concerning if it's against other soldiers or governments or things like that. Whereas if it's terrorism, it's going against innocent people. It's going against civilians. And so to say that Renee Good and Alex Preddy were terrorists, in my mind, I mean, this is the least of our concerns, but in my mind, they're definitely not terrorists, because a terrorist goes against non-government actors. It goes against civilians to create chaos. That's why 9/11 and Oklahoma City and terrorist acts are attacks against people, not leaders. This is the least important part of everything that's been going on, but it's really not even domestic terrorism. Even if I were to be as generous as possible that they were actually somehow putting the officers in harm's way, which it does not look to me like they were.
Right. And I think there's also a difference between the technical terms used by experts,
correct,
in this case political scientists, versus the colloquial terms used in the public and in the political context.
Right.
So terrorism is definitely a political term used
yes.
for political purposes. And as is frequently said, like, my freedom fighter is your terrorist.
Correct.
So it completely depends on your perspective and which side you're on.
Right.
Et cetera. So it just becomes, in a way, it's a meaningless label used for rhetorical, political propaganda purposes.
Right.
When used that way, not by a political scientist trying to come up with
actually be specific. And even within that, there's many arguments about what counts. It's not like they've come to the number like, it's 4, and
right.
and there's a great agreement. I mean, this reminds me of two other things. One, remember in George W. Bush's administration, it was actually the war on terror.
Yes.
Was the way that it was phrased. And I remember at the time thinking, this makes me so angry, not just as a political scientist, but it's like, this isn't a war on the emotion or the feeling of terror.
Yeah.
I mean, I would like us all to not feel terror. But it was to your point that politicians will use it in as fast and loose a way as is needed to serve some point, because that's a catchy thing. It's a war on terror, right? It's not the war on terrorism, because that's a whole complicated thing, but terror.
All right, but that's not what we're talking about today.
Right.
We just did talk about it. But the main topic that we're talking about today is immigration. Let's run the numbers. Let's just throw out some statistics there, just so there is an objective reality. We may not have like the most completely precise numbers, because it turns out undocumented people are undocumented, and so we don't always have very precise statistics. But there's lots of ways we do get actual numbers, and let's look at those numbers and see what the story is, and then we'll go from there to what are the implications for what's happening in America right now and policy choices.
Right. And really, I think the big argument to justify what ICE is doing and why ICE is in the United States and operating in different parts of the country, particularly in Minneapolis, is that they're protecting against a threat from illegal immigration. And so I thought, let's get some numbers on immigration overall, illegal immigration. And so I thought I'd start with some data that comes from the Migration Policy Institute. And they have been tracking the number of immigrants into the United States. And for now, we'll start legal and not legal immigrants into the United States. The overall number is, do you know what the number is?
That are in right now, it's around 50 million?
It's around 50 million. Yeah. So we have a chart here that shows that, and this number has been increasing. So this data goes back from 1860 and shows that we did see a bit of an increase in immigration into the United States in the late 1800s, early 1900s. That's one of the big waves of immigration into the country. It decreased into the 60s and 70s, and then lo and behold, it has increased remarkably from 1970s through today to a high of 50 million. However, if you consider immigration as a percentage of the total United States population, so the United States population has been growing as well. The world population has been growing as well. The total percentage of, do you know the number of immigrants as a percentage of the American population?
It's like 20%?
15.
15, okay.
Yeah, it's the numbers, as you said, are a little bit hard to say at the margins, but it's between 14 and 16%.
Yeah,
Some numbers have it as high as 16% in recent years, which is a high, but it's very comparable to what the numbers looked like, again, during that big immigration wave in the 1900s.
So it's not historically high. But it is recently on the upswing.
Depending on your point of view, if you think that the 16% is a fair, because we're arguing now between 14 and 16% of the population, the 16% would be a very slight historical high, but not leagues ahead or way beyond what we've seen for decades, say in the late 1800s.
And to be clear, we're talking about everyone in the U.S. who was not born here.
Correct.
So, and half of them, though, are citizens.
Half of them are naturalized citizens. So,
right.
So in order to be an immigrant, you have to be born somewhere other than the United States. And so if you were born somewhere other than the United States and you moved here when you were 1 or you moved here when you were 60, you would get counted in this number. And indeed, half of that, about 46%, again, the numbers are fuzzy, about half are fully naturalized citizens. And just to be clear, if you are the child of someone who was from another country and you were born here, you are not an immigrant. You might say, I have an immigrant family or I come from immigrant heritage.
You're born here, you're not an
But you wouldn't be
definition.
in these numbers. That's correct.
Yeah.
And I think that's worth pointing out because I do, there is evidence that ICE, for example, is stopping people who look like they're from somewhere else simply because they're not white, despite the fact that many, many people in the United States are not white.
Or they have an accent is enough.
Exactly. So about half of this 14 to 16% are naturalized citizens. So they've taken they've taken the test and they've said the oath and they've that test that Americans can't pass.
Right.
That's the one. We should do that sometime and see how we do on the citizenship test. About a quarter, 23%, are lawful permanent residents.
Yeah.
So these are people here who are here long-term, work visas, green cards, married to an American, waiting to go through the citizenship process, totally lawful. About 4% are temporary lawful residents. So think, people here on a student visa.
Yeah.
Many of my college students at NYU would fall under this category. They're totally legal. It's a temporary visa, and it goes away if you graduate and don't get a job in the United States. So this brings us to the 27% or so that has everybody worked up. Well, has many people worked up. And the claim here is, so we have about a quarter of the immigrants in this country are under broadly what is considered unauthorized. Now we get into some legal...
About 14 million people.
Yes.
14 million, yeah.
Yes. And now we get into some legal terms. I'm not a lawyer. I don't think you managed to get a law degree in the middle of being a doctor. But the debate really is not just, okay, you're unauthorized. Unauthorized doesn't mean you're illegal. It just means you don't have the full protections of, say, lawful permanent residence or a student visa or you're a citizen. So what it could mean is that some of that, about half of that 27%, about half, so 16% of all immigrants, are fully considered to have no protections. So the 16% of foreign-born people in the United States are considered fully not protected. So this is the undocumented, illegal, we don't know if they're here or not. And these estimates come from kind of making sense of a variety of different types of census data to make an estimate, because you, by definition, don't have documentation on this.
And I know there's a lot of discussion about, are they by necessity, these 8 million people now that we're left with?
That's right.
Are they by necessity illegal? And this is not just about using polite terms. It's a technicality here. So, for example, if you are seeking asylum,
yes,
and you didn't break any laws,
right,
but you don't have any protected status, you're in that category.
That's right.
You didn't break any laws.
That's right.
Right. Other people got here by breaking civil laws, but not criminal laws.
Yep.
Like if you overstay your visa,
right,
that's a lot of those people. They just overstayed their visa,
right.
So they're unauthorized,
right.
They don't have any protective status, but they didn't break any criminal laws. They broke the civil law by overstaying their visa.
Right.
Not all of these people are people who evaded border
That's
security
right.
and crossed the border illegally, which is actually committing a crime.
That's right.
So that's why the term like illegal alien doesn't capture the whole category.
That's right.
It only is a subset of them.
That's right. And I do think that, and again, I'm not a law person, but the term unauthorized immigrants is the broadest. Is the broadest.
Yeah.
And exactly, about half are here legally or were once legal, and so there is some documentation, and they've overstayed, which, as you said, is not a criminal charge. And we have a lot of asylum seekers, refugees, and other folks who have been granted permission to be here,
yes,
and are actively going through the process of entering one of these other buckets. Just like you can go through the process of being a permanent resident to a citizen, you can go through the process of being here in an unauthorized or sort of ultra temporary way and still make your way. So it's not that this is the group that's just all out there committing crimes, which we'll get to.
Right. And then also that 14 million, that 27% includes the DACA, right? So these are the deferred action for children of, I forget what the acronym is.
Yeah, I do too.
But it's basically, they broke no laws. That's 6 million people.
Their parents brought them in.
Their parents brought them in. So they personally, they could have been an infant. So they didn't personally break any laws, but they are unauthorized to be here. So that's 6 million people.
Right.
I think nobody wants, really, there's not a big movement. I'm sure some people do, to kick them out of the country. These are people who if you were here since you were 1 and you speak English and this is the only country you knew, you don't know your parents' country of origin at all.
Any more than I know about the Netherlands, which is where my
so there's strong public support for some kind of protected status for these children of unauthorized immigrants.
There was some debate in Trump 1.0 about Dreamers and DACA, but deferred action for childhood arrivals.
Yes, there we go.
There we go. Thank you to our all-knowing Ian on that. So we're talking about a very tiny sliver of the population.
Right.
Now, folks who are concerned about this population would say it doesn't matter if it's relatively small, it's the activities and the things that they're doing, and we'll get to that. But just to emphasize that the vast majority of who we're talking about when we think about Americans are, 86% of us are U.S. born, and most of the remaining are naturalized citizens. And then within that, again, even within unauthorized. And I will also say that language matters here.
Yeah.
So early on in my degree, I did some work around how we describe different international policies, and we use different sorts of languages. And there's a really interesting study that came out of the UK that basically said, on the right and on the left, we describe the same population in different ways. And so is someone a migrant? Are they an asylum seeker? Or are they a criminal, or are they an illegal, right? Calling someone, there are no illegal people, but we can speak of them that way to do some dehumanizing. So even if we agree on the numbers, there's a difference in language that we use around these populations. So another point that comes up in defense of stronger immigration crackdown is that before we talked about the rise in overall immigration, and the overall numbers are higher, but the percentage of immigrants relative to the U.S. population is roughly similar to times we've seen past. We can still debate whether that's too high or too low.
Yeah.
But another argument that's being made, and particularly has been made since the Biden administration by the Trump administration, is that the number of these unauthorized immigrants, again, not separating out whether they have some protections or no protections, that number is at an all-time high as of 2023. So there's some delay on these numbers as well, because we kind of get annual numbers at the end of each year, and so we expect 2024 numbers pretty soon. But a mapping from Pew Research Center since 1990 says that it's at this estimate that you said before of about 14 million estimated unauthorized immigrants is an all-time high since we've been tracking them in this way. So in 1990, it was 3.5 million. In 2007, it was about 12 million. That went down to about 10 million in 2019. And so it did go up notably to 14. And so that, again, is going to be your justification or part of the justification for crackdowns. However, even within those numbers, again, go back to that fuzzy line between unauthorized with some protections and unauthorized with no protections. A lot of that number is because of
asylum seekers, right?
Exactly. Policies under the Biden administration for folks coming out of Afghanistan and other places where we actively helped them get here.
Yeah.
This is not the same person that you're hearing about at, say, the Republican National Convention, which is someone coming over to commit crimes in your country. Another thing that's been going up, and this won't surprise you, is ICE arrests. So ICE, do you know the origins of ICE?
I mean, I know it's like 23 years old. It's fairly recent.
Yep.
And it's to basically get people who are already in the country unauthorized out of the country. It's not border security. So border security is separate.
Right.
This is inside the country.
Right. Right.
Yeah, to identify people. And mainly, until very recently, it's been used to identify and arrest people with a criminal record who are here and unauthorized.
Right. So I think we can, and as we start to get into what are the positions on the various political sides in this country on what to do about immigration and how much of a threat is it, I think another kind of nuance to tease out here is that even if we agree that unauthorized immigrants, let's say the subset within that, about 16% of all immigrants who have no protections.
Yeah.
So setting aside the asylum seekers and people who overstayed, the group with no protections, the argument there, I think, on different sides is, do all those people get kicked out? Or if we somehow encounter them, do we offer a path to citizency or to documentation? And do we only focus on the folks who have committed some kind of crime, which, as you say, that was ICE's mandate, which was to find those people.
Right.
Right. So ICE arrests have, not surprisingly, been going up since Trump took office. These numbers it's a place called the Deportation Data Project, which is a really interesting resource if you want to comb through. It's available data, and it's data, little asterisk, it's data that is reported from ICE. And so it is reported with a delay. It's given to the Deportation Data Project based on a FOIA request. And even then, there is a fair amount of work that goes in to kind of coax this information out. And so I'm not in a position to say, oh, we don't trust it because of who it came from. Like, I'm generally in a position to take government data seriously. But I do want to note that this data does come only as a result of great pestering to get this data out. This is not data that is being willingly given. So ICE arrests have been increasing. The numbers I've got go back to September of 2023. There are about 12,000 ICE arrests in the United States per month. 12,000 ICE arrests per month, and that has hovered between 10 and 12,000 through September of 2023, all the way through September of 2024. Trump takes office January of 2025. That number around then was still at your 10, 12%. And then immediately we see an uptick to the point where in May of 2025, so May of last year, we went from about 10,000 arrests per month to 30,000 arrests per month. So a threefold increase. And this increase coincided, by the way, with some statements by the Trump administration saying, we need to up our efforts. We need to meet some quotas. And I don't have the numbers since, but they are starting to come out, and I believe we can drum up through October, but that would not include a lot of things that have been happening in November, December, January. I mean, this is data that changes day to day. But so those arrests have increased. However, the accuracy of those arrests has decreased. So the overall number of people arrested, but the percentage of those people who are convicted criminals is lower than it was.
It's only like 3-4%.
It's
from what I read.
About 40% are convicted criminals of the arrests.
Of all the arrests.
Of all the arrests.
I thought of all people deported.
Not deported. This is just arrested.
Oh, just arrest. I'm sorry.
Yeah. So
I think I was quoting the deported.
Yeah. So this is just arrested.
Yeah.
So of all the people, so ICE is arresting 30,000 people per month, probably more right now. I don't know for sure. Of all of those 30,000, about 40% are convicted criminals. 30% are pending criminal charges, which means they've just been someone said they did something, right? So that in the eyes of the American law, I think they're not criminals. And then 30% have no charges or convictions. These numbers are a dramatic switch from the previous year. So in the previous year, more than half of ICE arrests were convicted criminals. Still not a great number. And only about 24% were pending and 20% had no charges. So basically, we're rounding up more people, and you could argue that this is simply how you do it, is you arrest more people, and then it turns out you're getting a lower percentage of the criminals that you're seeking.
Right.
So if we are looking to deport criminals, we could say, well, why don't we be a little more circumspect about who we're arresting? That's one strategy.
I think it's important to note that immigrants of any stripe do not commit more crimes than native-born Americans. In fact, they commit fewer crimes.
Correct.
Well, I think it's hard to say how many they commit. It's easier to say that they are arrested for crimes because we know for sure. We have numbers on how many people get arrested.
Right.
So,
I mean, maybe you make the argument that people born outside of the country are sneakier and getting away with more crimes. I mean, that seems very difficult.
It seems very difficult. Yes. But there's another way to look at the data, right? So one data is just like, if you look at people committing crimes and what is their status in terms of immigrant versus non-immigrant.
Or people who are arrested for a crime.
So arrested for a crime, we have the best data. For committing crimes, we can estimate not as good data, but both show fewer on the part of immigrants. But we could also look at just population-wise in places where there are different percentages of the population are immigrant. Does that correlate with overall crime?
Right.
And the answer is no correlation.
There you go.
Not in either direction. There's just basically no correlation between how many immigrants in a community and how many crimes are being committed. So that's two different data points that strongly point in the direction of there's no immigrant crime wave. They're not committing, and it makes sense, because if you're an undocumented immigrant, right, you're no protection, right?
Like
the last thing you want is any encounter
a bunch of
with law
legal
enforcement.
attention,
And
law enforcement attention, for sure.
So if your goal is to stay here, you want to be a good citizen,
right?
And it, by all accounts, most of them are. Now, of course, there are exceptions, and those are the people who we should round up. I mean, I think everyone agrees.
Right.
Yeah, if you're here illegally, like you're unauthorized, and you commit a crime, absolutely you should get arrested and deported.
Right.
Have you heard anybody disagree with that? I mean,
I have not. I am sure that there are, and we were talking about this just before we started recording, that there's we tend to hear about policy views in a camp. If you're either pro-immigration and therefore you love illegal immigrants and you don't mind if they rape and kill your families, or you hate them and you care about America and you want them out. And obviously neither, I mean, there are people with either of those, I think, maybe not, but they're a vast minority.
But those are the fringe extremes at most.
We've already given them too much airtime just by saying that. And
no, again, but it's important to know, because this is part of what we talk about on this show. There's actually, where most issues, and this is one, most people are in the middle and actually agree more than they disagree.
Right.
But the politicians are telling us the other side wants open borders. Nobody wants open borders.
Right.
And
very few people want open borders.
Very few. Nobody, I haven't heard a politician say,
sure,
yes, we should have open borders and let anybody.
I'm hearing my random libertarian friends say.
Whatever. But I mean, most like on the Democratic side of the Senate are saying, no, we want border protection. We just want to go about it in a humane way, in a responsible way, et cetera. Right. And I don't think most people on the right, there is some rhetoric there, want there to be zero immigration.
That's right.
Or, you know what I mean? So everyone was like, yeah, we should have legal immigration and we should control our borders.
Right.
Everyone, right? But it's really, the discussion is about what are the best steps to take in order to make that happen.
Right.
Hopefully without turning our country into a police state.
Right.
Which I think most people, again, there's probably more agreement than disagreement on there when you're not dealing with the straw men, on the other side.
Right. And I think that there is, the straw men are the easiest to post about, to cite, to talk about when you're in a heated disagreement with somebody. One of the arguments when folks were responding to the Alex Preddy murder were saying, ICE is overstepping. We need to get ICE out of Minneapolis. ICE needs to have more training. Whatever argument, defund ICE. Like, there's a range of arguments about what ought to be done about ICE. One of the counterpoints that I was seeing from those who are in support of what ICE is up to. We're saying, well, obviously someone who wants to hold back ICE doesn't care about other people who've been murdered by illegal immigrants and other people who are being losing their jobs and it's just that's not the same argument. You can have multiple views at one time, which is we shouldn't have ICE overstepping, and of course we want some kind of sensible policy that takes any kind of criminal, never mind their immigration status, off the street.
Right.
And I think, another piece of the puzzle here, and we haven't released our episode on polarization yet, but a very unpopular thing that I have to say about polarization gets to exactly what you are saying, which is, generally speaking, the research on our ideological positions shows that most Americans are somewhere in the middle, and we agree more than we disagree. And so, yes, there are the extreme views on the right that say arrest everybody and then figure out if they're innocent later, maybe or maybe not. And people on the far left are super libertarian who say dissolve all borders, we all are earthlings or whatever, right?
Yeah.
But most of us want some semblance of a pathway to be here legally and some thoughtfulness around what it looks like to work with someone who is here illegally.
And I think just fix the system, right? I think, again, and politically, there's a lot of agreement over, we need more resources so that people are not hanging out waiting for their trial or whatever. And, we need to process these asylum seekers more efficiently, et cetera, et cetera. Everyone agrees with that pretty much.
Right.
That's again, broad sort of consensus in the middle for these. Make the system work well, make it be fair, make it be humane, but control the borders, but have, we do want people who want to come here to be able to come here legally without taking years and years and years to go through paperwork, because immigrants are hugely beneficial to our economy.
That's right.
We could do almost a whole separate episode
Maybe we should.
The economic effects of immigration, because again, every economist I've heard write or speak about is like, it's really good.
It's really good for the U.S. economy, and I actually, over the past few days, was reading a bit about the value for broader globalization and building ties with other countries and remittances back home, whether that makes a difference for those countries. Harder to tell a story that we should allow it because it's good for the rest of the world in this current political climate, but it is a net positive for the United States, and it can be a net positive more broadly.
There's another, on the economic thing, there's another statistic that, again, I think you just have to know if you're going to talk meaningfully about immigration, and that is that immigrants do pay taxes.
Yes.
Right? Even completely unauthorized, undocumented, no protection immigrants, they pay sales tax, obviously, and if they do have a job, they get taxes deducted from their wages, and they receive fewer services than citizens, right? So not that they basically get emergency services. No one's going to kick them out of an emergency room. You know.
I watched The Pit. I get it.
Yeah, you can't. It's unethical. Yeah. So they get emergency services, but they're not getting food stamps and they're not getting Social Security.
Again, because you want to keep your head down.
Right.
If you're not getting paid.
And you're not in the system by definition. Yeah. So they actually pay more in taxes than they get in services. Right. So they are therefore, this is numbers. This is demonstrable. They're not therefore a drain on the system or a drain on services.
Right.
That's just the numbers.
Right. So I thought we should probably talk also about, so given all of this, why do we see at least a divergence in national level party platforms and a lot of politicians, and again, I'm cutting back to the RNC chanting, send them home. Yeah. Why do we see
Because, Andrea, they're eating the dogs.
Oh, the dogs.
And they're eating the cats.
Oh.
So,
I'll never forgive you for reminding me of that. I got that out of my brain.
By which I mean, because there's a lot of misinformation. There's a narrative. Both sides have a narrative, and that narrative is not accurate to reality. I don't, again, not to imply symmetry, there definitely is a massive asymmetry. That where, at this particular moment, the political right has demonized immigrants as a major part because they think it's a winning political issue for them, and it was. I mean, you can't fault them politically for taking this issue on because it helped got Trump elected the second time. And that's because of that rhetoric. So that's the narrative, but there's a massive disconnect between that narrative and reality.
Yes. And in fact, we have some numbers around public opinion surveys. And so this is my favorite, the American National Election Study. So this isn't your media-led poll. This is a bunch of political scientists who've been doing things for decades. This particular questions go back to the 90s, but basically from the 90s until, lo and behold, 2015, 2016, Democrats and Republicans were self-identified Democrats and Republicans in these surveys, largely were in agreement about whether or not the number of immigrants allowed into the U.S. should be decreased. Slightly more Republicans, about 50% of Republicans for decades said, the number of illegal immigrants should be decreased, and Democrats were hovering at like 46%.
Yeah.
So it was
very
pretty close. Very close until 2012. So Obama's second term. I can't think of and then we see this gap absolutely split, where now we see in 2016, lo and behold, Trump is campaigning, Trump is elected. 2016, 63% of Republicans said that the amount of overall immigrants should be decreased. Nevertheless, that's still only 63%. I mean, it's a lot, but that means that there's a lot of Republicans who don't think that you need to. So there's that policy overlap. And that number plummeted among Democrats to 28%. Thought that those numbers should be decreased. We see a little bit of coming together, a little bit not really. In 2020, we see the Democrats actually kind of really fall to 14% of Democrats think the number of immigrants should be decreased in 2020. And now Trump is back in power, 2024, we see those numbers go back up. And so you could tell a story. It's an overly simplistic correlational story, but you could tell a story that leaders talking about immigration affects policy views.
Yeah.
And you know, at the same time as leaders are talking about it on the right, you could argue that leaders are not talking about it on the left. And maybe they should have been. Maybe there should have been more clarity about who's coming in and asylum seekers and all of that. And instead, it just wasn't really a talking point.
Yeah, which I get. I mean, you don't want to play into the talking point that the other side is winning. But at the other side of that coin, though, is that means you let the other side define the issue and define your position.
Exactly.
And I think my sense is that's what happened.
Exactly. And I think, you know, you've covered this at great length in the Skeptic's Guide, but I think that's some of what the understanding around what's been happening with climate change and maybe to an extent vaccines as well is like, well, they're obviously ignoring the numbers. And so we're not even going to give them the energy of our time because we know what the reality is. And so that's sometimes you have to talk about
you have to confront the misinformation,
even if you don't want to platform or make more salient.
I mean, so we have this debate for the last 30 years. We've been involved in science communication and correcting misinformation. Do you breathe life into an issue by correcting it, by giving it airtime?
Right.
And we settled, I think the evidence and our experience, we've sort of settled on the notion that if something is wallowing in anonymity, leave it alone, right? If it's a fringe, small issue, some outlier, whatever, do not give it life by giving it attention. But if something is in the mainstream,
vaccines,
climate, you absolutely need to address it. Like, we're not going to be feeding this issue by talking about it, but by allowing it, misinformation to go unanswered, that does way more damage.
Right.
So that's kind of the compromise. But again, where's that line?
Like, have we just caught? I was just going to name some of what I thought were fringe theories, and then as an example of what we're not going to talk about. And I was like, I better not talk about it. So there is a
context and venue matters as well, right? I think we can trust our audience with this kind of information.
Right.
So it's a lot of variables, and again, I sort of gestalt it.
Right. I think I want to say one more thing about public opinion on this that really stuck out to me. So we see this diversion in Democrats and Republicans. We see the increase in talking points on the right. We don't see unanimous that means we're all standing out in the streets yelling, send them home.
Yeah.
That's not what that means, but it means that those voices are loud. And if we don't have much discussion on the left, that's all you're going to hear. You're going to hear about eating cats and dogs. You're not going to hear about thoughtful possibilities towards citizenship or whatever.
Right.
One other thing that really stood out to me when I was looking into all of this is this is a study from Pew, much more recent, about why we think immigration to the U.S. is increasing. So we started by talking about, like, it is, as a percentage of U.S. population, it's increasing a little. Overall numbers increasing a lot. Why? So if you go around and ask Democrats and Republicans in this Pew study, you get a really different picture about why they think this is happening. So the most common response from Democrats, if I didn't have this in front of me, I'd make you guess. But the most common response from Democrats is that they're coming to the United States because of violence in their home countries. I should also say that we've had these waves of immigration in the past at roughly this level. This is the first wave, and this wave has been going on for some time, that they're not European immigrants. And so right before we started recording, we thought, well, how much of this is racism? And one thing to note is that this wave is much more people immigrating. Mexico is the largest, but by no means the only. There's many other places, and we're seeing people who are not white coming in. So
I have the top 5 are Mexico, India, China, Philippines, and then different numbers for the 5th one, El Salvador, other ones.
Right. So we're talking about brown people as opposed to the Irish and the Italians, like how your family came over and my family came over.
Well, apparently we were too swarthy for the wasps of the last century. Or
that's
whatever.
right. Yeah.
Whenever somebody gets into the country, establishes themselves, they don't want anyone to come in behind them. There's a close the door behind you kind of phenomenon.
Right. So 79% of Democrats say that they think that the main reason for increasing immigration in the United States is violence in home countries. So we're leaving a bad situation to come here.
Yeah. Which there's some truth to.
There's some truth to that.
Yeah.
The next most common, pretty close, 76%, say that it's for good economic opportunities in the U.S. That's consistent with my understanding of reality.
Yep.
And then a very relatively small percentage, about 40%, say that they do so because of a belief that once you get to the U.S., it's easy to stay in the U.S. This is not something in full transparency that I was aware of as people thinking about as a reason. However, that is the most common response among Republican respondents. They say the most common, the most likely reason for why people are coming into the U.S. and why those numbers are increasing is because they think that we're soft on immigration, and so once you get here, you can stay here. The next most common response at 67% is the economic one, and just under half agree that it might be because of violence.
Right.
And so it's not even just, when we think about public opinion, we think about polarization, we think about divisions, it's not even just what's your preferred policy standpoint. It's an underlying, and this gets to Josh Tucker's comments on misinformation, it's an underlying narrative that's very, very different.
It's emphasis.
Yeah.
I love it when I completely agree with somebody. But they have a totally different narrative built out of the same facts, mainly just different emphasis.
Which again, we see this more with the Renee Good footage than with the Alex Preddy footage. But that's roughly what we're seeing, which is like we can agree that this happened and then this happened and then this happened.
Yeah, Renee Good was like a Rorschach test, right?
Yeah.
But then when the Preddy video, not so much. That was like, that was bad. Like I didn't hear. I heard lots of people trying to defend the Good shooting. Same people did not making those arguments about Preddy.
Yes.
Part was the double hit maybe, but it was also, I think they disarmed him. He was on his knees. He was shot in the back. It's a lot harder to argue.
Yeah.
Like that.
10 times.
That he was threatening.
11 times.
Yeah.
The other thing, and maybe there's a skeptical, critical thinking term for this, is around, to go back to Renee and Alex, is that there was a fair amount of conversation defending the ICE agents that had to do with assessments of Renee and Alex's character. And that seems awful. I mean, again, I'm not a lawyer, but someone is murdered. It shouldn't matter what you think about how they live their life.
Right.
Again, not a criminal.
But they were very different. It was easy for the right rhetorically to sort of smear Renee Good and her wife. Right. But Preddy is a ICU nurse working at the VA treating veterans.
Who joined the medical practice during COVID or just after COVID.
Poster child for not the guy you want on the other side politically.
Yeah.
I mean, it was. I think it's another reason for the disconnect. Yeah. All right, so Andrea.
Yes.
What do we do about all this? How do we fix immigration?
Do I have an easy answer for you, Steve? It's 300 and the end. So one thing that I think is lost in the conversation about what do we do with, I mean, obviously, it's a very important conversation, what ICE is doing right now.
Yes.
And that's very urgent, and it's rightly at the top of our minds and a lot of people's minds. There are other things you can do about immigration besides, believe it or not, besides take to the streets and harm people. There are things you can do around actual physical border security. So in Mexico, there was, I don't know if you remember, at some point we were going to build some kind of a wall, but there are other ways to enforce border security if we decide that that's a way that we want to go through with this, using other kinds of more sophisticated technology than a wall. But there's also other things you can do where you say, okay, if you're in this country, come forward and let's talk about a path to citizenship. Let's talk about policies for, another concern that many folks have around immigration. I've seen this more in Europe, but I see it in the United States as well, is you see political leaders on the right say, I'm less worried about immigration. I'm more worried about multiculturalism and a lack of assimilation. So if that's the concern that we have, and there's an asterisk on whether that's something that we ought to be concerned about.
Yeah.
You can say, well, what if we offer, and my mother used to teach these actually in the 90s, what if we offer English as a second language to folks who've moved here for work or for school or for whatever? And she used to teach a lot of scientists who would come to my hometown English. They were great scientists, but didn't speak English, so okay. Or other things, you incorporate them into our cultural practices and do things for kind of path to citizenship and path to belonging.
Right.
There's some whitewashing and some other things going on there, but that's one, we could be having that conversation instead of screaming at each other, right?
So, for example, you could expand migrant workers, right? Give people like day passes to come over the border and work, in California and whatever those in border states, so they don't have to get here illegally to get work.
Right.
Because obviously there's the demand.
Right.
And nature abhors a vacuum. If there's a demand, someone's going to fill it.
Right.
We could either fill it legally or we could fill it illegally.
Right.
And so that's another way. Of course, reducing or improving, the conditions in the countries that are sending us the people.
That's a huge piece of it.
Yeah, if you're fleeing violence, well, you could fix that by reducing the violence where people are coming from. That's obviously a long-term, very difficult thing to do, but that efforts to do that can be helpful as well.
I mean, it's not a coincidence. I mean, there's geographic proximity, but it's not a coincidence that we saw a lot of numbers increase from Mexico, though those numbers have been decreasing recently.
And then, just obviously improving the immigration system itself, right? So there's enough judges so that cases aren't waiting for 2 years where people are basically hanging out for 2 years waiting for their asylum case to be heard. The more quickly we could process those cases, obviously the fewer people are going to be stuck in the middle of the system. So there's a lot of little fixes that we could do, and then we could have a functional immigration system. I think this is always frustrating. It's like there's political consensus on a lot of things we should do. There is consensus among most people, again, that 80% in the middle.
And even if I'm a little bit, actually, let's not make it that much easier to become a citizen. And I say, let's make it a lot more easier. I mean, that's a conversation we can have.
That's the compromise
even if
conversation
we're a little
that
apart.
We should be having in the middle. Exactly. But it's amazing how we can't get anything done because just the two extremes are screaming at each other. And so, again, we feel, just like with so many issues in this country, and this is probably another episode, is why can't we get, policies that most people support passed?
Right.
It's like, it seems like we're kind of broken when it comes to that. And this is one of the big issues.
Right.
Partly, again, you tell me what you think about this. A lot of what I hear is that politicians don't necessarily want to fix an issue that they're using to get elected, to drive engagement.
Yes.
You feel that there's data to back that up?
I would hesitate only because I don't have the data off the top of my head, and I want to make sure that I get this right. But in general, there is, let me give you some analogous data, which is there's a lot of interesting research that shows that when you think about natural disasters, one of the really helpful things about natural disasters for local leaders, like mayors, is that if there is a natural disaster that hits, and then you're seen as someone who really did a great job cleaning things up, that's a huge electoral boost for you in a way that preparing well for a natural disaster and preventing it from being so bad doesn't get you that electoral boost. So that's that kind of avoiding the crisis is almost not so politically effective. Up to a point.
Responding to the crisis is better than preventing it politically.
And so being able to walk around and say, I'm the tough guy and I'm making your streets safer is much more appealing. It's much more tweetable. It's much more, look at me old-fashioned calling it Twitter. It's much more Xable, I don't know what the word is, than saying, hey, we actually went out of our way to build in some thoughtful on-ramps for how to translate these temporary visas for people who are clearly paying taxes and contributing to our society to help them. So the other thing that we're not hearing about is that the Trump administration has also done a fair amount to reduce the number of visas being given out in the first place. So we're reducing legal avenues for totally legally coming here, and also rescinding existing visas.
Yeah, and converting people from protected to unprotected status.
Which is a wonderful way to increase those numbers as well.
Right, because they got a quota.
Exactly. So it's I do think it's a broader conversation about sort of where do we go, kind of two questions that have come up for me, I guess, as all of this has unfolded in the last few days, is one, to your point, where do we go to get out of a system where leaders seem to be not incentivized to work in our long-term best interest?
Yeah. I think they seem to get incentivized when there's a public outcry.
Yes.
But in order for there to be a public outcry, the public have to be informed.
Yes.
Because if they're just listening to the politicians, then
or each other in their
whatever
ecosystems.
Right, but remember, like if the politicians are saying this is what you should be angry at, then it's hard to hold the politicians accountable.
Right.
We need to know, no, we want to fix the system, not just be outraged by misinformation.
Right.
And then we can put pressure on politicians to overcome their short-term political interests.
Right.
To actually fix the problem.
Which brings me to the kind of second thing I've been thinking about a lot, and I know others have been thinking about it too, which is in the wake of what happened on Saturday, the murder of Alex Preddy, there was a lot of talk about like, how do we get out of our information ecosystems?
Yeah.
Because if you're only listening, and again, we're trying not to be partisan here, but when one side is lying, it's going to sound partisan. But when Kristi Noem comes up and says this is a domestic terrorist who's trying to create, or someone else said they're trying to create, mass destruction and all of these things, and if you could just look at the video, you'd see that's not what's happening. The question was, how do we break through? I mean, one is the leaders, but the other is, we're in our algorithms. They've been tailored to us. I am, by design, my own design, and by the tech company's design, not getting an understanding of what the other perspectives are, and nor are they. So it's no amount of evidence matters if we're not seeing all the evidence. And so I think that's another big open question and another episode for us around, political persuasion, breaking through. And it's very much an open question.
Thank goodness for the videos.
Yeah.
But for how much longer are we going to have that before AI videos?
It's already,
I know they already exist, but
yeah.
But so far, like with these two incidents, public opinion has been swayed by actual videos.
Yes.
And the AI videos have not either pushed it aside or swamped it or controlled the narrative.
Yep.
I wonder if that's going to continue to be the case.
Yeah.
Because there is something powerful, one citizen with a cell phone with a video camera.
The pink lady
is powerful still. Hopefully maybe that will stay the case. Maybe we're being too doom and gloom about the fake video stuff, but we'll see what happens.
It is already the case that the fact that there are videos from multiple angles around both has been a big corroborating factor.
Absolutely.
And it makes it harder to dismiss it as fake news.
Yeah, exactly. I agree. That's a good segue.
Yes, I think so.
We're gonna close out the immigration thing. We're gonna answer our first email on the show.
Yes.
So thank you for watching our show, listening, for sending us feedback, for commenting online, for sending us email. The best thing about these kind of formats is that there's some interaction.
Yes.
So we talked on one of the episodes released was on misinformation.
Yep.
And we got some feedback about that, which gives us an opportunity to explain some of the nuance of what we were saying. And I think the big complaint was that, so if you remember on the misinformation, there's basically the two types or two
first
negative
order,
effects.
second order.
First order and second order negative effects from misinformation. One is that you believe something that's not true. That's the first order. The second order is because there's so much misinformation out there, it gives you permission to not believe something that is true.
Right.
You dismiss true information as fake news.
And that's I think the example that Professor Josh Tucker gave us at that time was when Trump came out and started calling anything he disagreed with fake news.
Fake news.
In
that
2016.
Term. And other politicians started mimicking him.
Yeah.
That's fake news. I don't want it to be true.
Yeah.
So
both are bad.
Yeah, so both are bad, but some people came away with the impression that we were saying that the first order is not a problem or that we were downplaying it.
Right.
And that nothing could be further from the truth.
Right.
Misinformation is, in and of itself, a huge problem.
Huge.
Obviously, I've spent my career as a science communicator
point of your podcast.
and a skeptic to correct misinformation. But it's interesting because the point where we're drawing attention to the second order effect because that's often neglected. People don't necessarily intuitively understand that that's a problem. It can be bigger than the first order problem.
Right.
And if you exaggerate the first order problem, it could actually make the second order problem worse.
Right.
None of which implies that misinformation is not itself harmful and shouldn't be addressed.
Right.
But Andrew and I were talking about this. I was telling her because I've dealt with this frequently in the skeptical realm, especially with medicine. So I had this experience many times where I'm giving an hour or 2 hour long lecture on all the ways that scientific research or specifically medical research can be fudged, right? You could put your thumb on the scale, you could do it wrong, p-hacking, all that stuff. And then I get a question at the end, it's like, so how do we trust anything? It's like, that's right. I have to balance this with, that doesn't mean you can't trust anything or that there's no reliable information out there.
Yeah.
That was the second order problem.
Right.
Because the pseudoscience are like, that's right. They'd agree with everything I'm saying.
Science is wrong.
All science can be dismissed out of hand because it's all in the pocket of Big Pharma or whatever. But we're not saying that. We're just saying the threshold of accepting something as probably true is higher. You have to go through a skeptical process to make sure that it isn't misinformation. But when you do that, you can reliably say, yeah, this is probably true. There's good, solid information for this. There's no red flags of misinformation. So it's complicated. Again, there's no like quickie, three things to do to never be fooled by misinformation, whatever. It's a complicated process, but you have to at least think about it and go through the process and be aware that there's belief in pseudoscience and there's denial of real science, and they're both a problem.
Right. And I think, I was in DC last week giving a talk about data science and how to think about data and the importance of science. And I have a slide, and I was thinking about this exact issue. I have a slide that says, a lot of people think science is just capital C correct because it's science and we believe science and trust science. And it's like, well, no. The point of science is to kind of get closer to the truth and admit when we're wrong and find out what we're missing. And as I was saying that, I'm in DC, the National Harbor and the Potomac River and all this stuff are right around me. I was like, I feel like I almost can't say this because it's permission to do the RFK Jr. We don't need to trust scientists.
It's so
ever.
hard. It's so hard. Sometimes our messaging is so difficult because we're coming from the point of it's complicated, it's nuanced, there's no objective, metaphysical certitude. Everything is probabilistic. Everything is just inference to the best explanation. People feel uncomfortable with the uncertainty. They feel uncomfortable with the doubt. And then it can inadvertently feed into the hands of the deniers and the pseudoscientists.
And the people who say all media is fake news.
Yeah, it's all fake news.
I believe Trump says this about all of left-ish.
You can't trust anything. There's this very high energy state in the middle, right? It's like on the top of a peak. You can fall off either side very easily, but you can maintain yourself in a position where, yes, you have to be on the lookout for misinformation all the time, but there are processes we can use to get to reliable, probabilistic inferences that are at least something we can act upon, and it's hopefully more likely to be true than not true. But damn, people hate that nuance and hate that uncertainty.
And I think, I don't want to put words in his mouth, but what I took away from something that Josh said is that it's really, both are a problem. First order concern, second order concern. If we don't know about the second order concern, we're not dealing with it. If we think the first order concern is worse than it is, if we think misinformation is everywhere, every time I open my phone, it's nothing but misinformation, that means we're living in a state of permanent second order concern. And the other piece of this, and this is why the empirical research on how much misinformation is out there, and this is like unauthorized immigrants, it's very hard to actually measure these things and who decides what's misinformation and how do we know how much is there. But the general finding, what he was saying is, it's a long tail. So there's some pockets of the internet, there's some communities, and there's
super spreaders
who are super spreaders, and so certain topics there is a ton of misinformation. First order problems are massive in certain areas, but that's not the same thing as saying every time I open my phone 70% of it is misinformation. It's not uniformly distributed. And maybe I said this here before, but it's sort of like we think of misinformation. I don't know if you're watching Stranger Things. I'm finally watching the last season. We think of misinformation as floating around in the ether like the white dust in the upside down, where it's kind of everywhere. But in fact, it's more like the Demogorgons, where it kind of shows up and it's like, it's about climate, and it's about vaccines, it's about what just happened in Minneapolis. And again, not to say that there's not a lot of it, but it's not
pervasive
in the way it's sort
not
of
all consuming.
Right. So thanks for your letter. We appreciate hearing from everybody. Obviously, politics is such a complicated and complex and nuanced thing that we obviously welcome all thoughts. We aren't claiming to be the final arbiters of truth. We're just doing an exercise.
Just trying to think our way through it with some data to back it up. Right.
Yeah. So and we're also very early, and this is a learning curve for the show, and both in terms of, I think, where we go into deep nuance and sort of where we don't. And so this was a great learning for us. And I think also, we record our episodes in such a way that it's hard to map to exactly what's happening in the news. And
we have to talk about that too. Yeah, we're not a news show, and because there's a delay, we try to be topical.
Right.
Like this episode, we are bumping up because of what's happening. But a lot of our episodes are what we call evergreen, meaning, we'll put them out when it's time to put them out, and they may not be necessarily dealing with anything happening in the news. But we are also exploring ways to
have shorter,
slip in things that are more topical, more timely, so that there's a balance.
I mean, we are in a world where literally the world, I think, we were living in on Friday of last week is fundamentally different from the world we're living in on Saturday.
Right.
And so I think we want to be mindful of that, and we're
Things
figuring
move
it out.
fast.
Yeah. So
Okay.
But thanks for watching.
See you next time.